Hi, everybody, and good afternoon from Lancashire in England. And we're very pleased to have the second in our 2022 CfHAS seminar series today. And to find out more about our seminar series, this is the second, so you've missed one, but it has been recorded. You can simply go to our website and I'll paste the link to that in the chat at some point. Okay, so today we've got Núria Almiron, and I have to admit she was one of my personal choices for the seminar series. I'm a big admirer of her work, and I think she is one of the most significant climate social scientists working today, and of course is very attentive to the role of human-animal relations in the climate crisis. So I'm really excited for her talk, and obviously, I also need to read out the formal bio for Núria from her website. So Núria Almiron is co-director of the UPF Center for Animal Ethics in Barcelona and a tenured professor in the Department of Communication at Pompeu Fabra University. Her main areas of research include and combine the ethics and political economy of communication, particularly interest groups and persuasive communication with critical animal studies, climate change, animal advocacy, and interspecies ethics. And I'm most familiar with her work on looking at the omission of the linkage between climate change and animal agriculture in the media and also in think tanks and that kind of thing. So I think Núria's most recent book is this one here. And this is in the Critical Animal Studies book series. By Brill, and it's co-edited with Natalie Casal, and as you can see, the title is Like an Animal, Critical Animal Studies Approaches to Borders, Displacement, and Othering. So that's a nice thick edited volume, which I would recommend to you, and also Claire has a chapter in that one as well. Great. So let me just get my bearings on things. Okay, so the title of Núria's talk today is Why Climate Crisis Rhetoric is Not Helping Animal Advocacy. So I will now hand over to Núria, who will speak for roughly 45 minutes. And then obviously we'll have time for discussion and questions after that. Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks, Richard. Can you hear me well? Yes? Okay. So, well, first of all, of course, thanks for inviting me and thanks for organizing this series. It's a pleasure and I'm honored to be here with you. I will share my screen. So you should be now seeing my screen. Yes, let's see. Okay, perfect. So, well, I am here today to talk about non-human animals, not about climate change actually, but I hope I will fulfill your expectations, and also thank you all the audience here and the colleagues and friends I know and I hear that they are here. My talk is about the effectiveness of using climate change arguments to defend non-human animals. That is, I am going to talk about how much helpful and contributing to animal liberation is the use of arguments related to the current climate crisis. And of course, it is no news that the discussion regarding what are the best arguments for animal advocacy is an ongoing debate, and probably a debate that will never be fully settled. Partly because we know there isn't such a thing as a perfect advocacy strategy, or in other words, a perfect advocacy strategy is the one best adapted to the target. Therefore, there are as many potential good strategies as publics exist. So I'm not pretending with this talk to settle the question at all, and just to share with you some ideas and thoughts about something that I called elsewhere greening animal defense, but that with time, progressively, and for this talk, I have referred here to as the climate change rhetoric, a rhetoric that has been increasingly incorporated into animal advocacy in recent years, to get some direct or indirect benefit for the animals. And as the title of this talk suggests, my stance, at least at present, is more against the use of this strategy than for it. Though I have to acknowledge that the title also is a little bit provocative for raising expectations and attracting you here. But it's true that I accept some, I am at the point that I understand that some exceptions can be accepted. For instance, if including the frame is decisive to secure funding, for instance, and is something that will not harm the focus of a research focus on animal defense, for instance. But it's true that for overt animal advocacy, my view on the topic has slowly but firmly moved towards what the title of this talk suggests. And this is what I'm going to try to argue here and explain why I have come to think that the climate crisis rhetoric may not be helping animal advocacy and maybe the opposite. So to address the question, I have divided the talk into 6 sections. First, I will clarify what I understand by climate change rhetoric and why I have chosen this term instead of, for instance, frame. Second, I will quickly examine the efficacy of the rhetoric. Third, I will produce what I see as the 4 most relevant arguments against the use of the climate change rhetoric in animal defense. And then I will produce some evidences of those arguments and will end up by addressing some counter arguments that my claim may face and wrap up with a final summary. So first, to justify my choice of the term rhetoric, let me first review some key figures regarding the current climate crisis, figures that you all know perfectly, but I need to settle my point here. First, Europe, as you may know, is the largest political unit in the world where global warming emissions have been more genuinely addressed, to put it this way. And according to the European Commission, for instance, the graph you have in front of you, CO2 emissions have been cut by 31%.
Núria, I'm still seeing the title slide. I don't know if
it's not moving.
Yeah, now, yeah.
Now it's moving?
Yes, we have the graph now. Yeah.
You have the graph. It's a little bit with a delay, I see. Okay, let me know, okay, if there is more delay, I can just stop the presentation and do it without full presentation. Maybe it works better.
Sure, seems fine at the moment. Thank you.
Okay, so CO2 emissions, according to European Commission, have been cut by 31% since the 1990s in the EU, which is a rather impressive reduction, if of course figures are right, which we can never check. But in any case, it's a rather important reduction, and this reduction refers only to carbon dioxide, not methane. But it is manifest if you look at the graph that the reduction has mostly taken place in the last decade alone. So since 2010, around 2010. This reduction, however, even if it's important, still leaves emissions in Europe at a very high level, and more sadly, this reduction is literally a drop in the ocean if we recap the global facts. Now moving to the next one, you should be now seeing 2 different graphs, 2 graphs that you also probably know very well. In the left, you can see how the European reduction is not only insufficient, but still has a major impact on the global account. In the right graph, you can see the OECD outlook for the next decades for CO2 emissions. These 2 graphs clearly show that at the global level, emissions have not been cut at all. Actually, the trend is that they will still increase, regardless of relevant regional reductions, like in the case of Europe. And the same applies, if not worse, for the methane emissions, which I have no time to show you. If I am reviewing these figures, it's of course not to discourage our efforts as Europeans, but just to get the global picture and, more important, the global trend. Global warming emissions are still increasing globally, and even in the very relevant case of Europe, emissions are still too high for climate stabilization, at least as we are told. So this is the context in which the climate change, climate crisis, climate emergency claim is born. And I use the term rhetoric for this claim in the negative connotation, and I have moved to the next slide. So you should be seeing the rhetoric of climate change in the title. And I am using this in the negative connotation And I mean with this that I'm not referring to rhetoric as the art of speech and argumentation, but as the speech which is empty, which is meaningless. And I think this is an appropriate concept here because of the contrast between reality and our response. And what is this reality about? Well, the reality is that we have been knowing that current climate change is anthropogenic, is human caused. We have been knowing this since the 1980s. And we know at least since the 1990s and probably earlier, who are the key polluters? What are the key sectors polluting? And among them, of course, animal agriculture is one of the most relevant. And we know this probably from the 1980s because at least Jeremy Rifkin in a book, the Beyond Beef book that was published in the 1993, was already talking about the impact of animal agriculture on climate change. So we have been knowing this for a long time. And on top of this, what we have created is a rhetoric which has eaten up all other environmental issues into this concept of climate crisis, which climate inaction and climate delay in policymaking has been the norm, with, for instance, the EU not really reacting until 10 years ago and very conservatively, which we all, society in general, is blaming denialists for all the problems, for the delay, for not acting, for not really reacting, etc. And in which at the same time, we have created an alarm and fear state, which is producing a very important state of eco-anxiety in a number of people. So all these 5 frames of response make up for a rhetoric because of the gap between the reality and the response. But let me explain a little bit better the last bullet point and the first one. So for the first one, by the climate crisis frame eating up all other environmental issues, I refer to the fact that we have turned climate change into the single major narrative regarding our behavior towards the planet. Environmental pollution, environmental damage, environmental harm is now mostly addressed because they impact on the climate, not because of them being wrong in the first place or because them poisoning life on Earth. Of course, we still talk about environmental harms, but the climate crisis has finally turned it into the grand narrative. A large number of environmental concerns have been overshadowed, somehow absorbed and eclipsed by the climate change rhetoric. For instance, the pollution of drinking water by farms and industries, the pervasive use of pollutants in agriculture that kill so many other animals and poison the fruits and vegetables we eat, the many toxics we are in contact with because of obsolete or negligent practices in construction or packaging. The list of environmental issues that are not producing a direct impact on the climate, but still are worrying, is very long. However, the resources, the time and attention we devote to them pale in comparison to the resources, time and attention devoted to the climate change narrative. And please note that I am saying to the narrative, not to addressing the problem. The resources and time devoted to talk, discuss, evaluate, argue, delay, postpone, sidestep climate change are unprecedented compared to the resources devoted to direct action. It could allow for another discussion also the framing of this narrative. The war metaphor, which is dominant in the narrative, is not helping either. That we need to be at war with all the problems we face should raise suspicions, to say the least. As a headline of an article put it, the fight climate change narrative is not saving nature, it's just selling ads. Furthermore, the climate change rhetoric has a major ethical problem, which I have not included in this box. The climate only became our major concern once we realized it is a threat to our species. It is our interest alone what turns the narrative into a grand narrative. It is not that our impact on the climate is wrong because polluting is wrong or because damaging life on Earth is wrong. Our impact on the climate is wrong because it is bad for our lifestyle. Of course, fortunately, many people are concerned beyond themselves. But this is not what triggers the grand narrative. The grand narrative of the climate crisis is what it is, because we know that this will kill us. In the 1990s, we already knew about climate change, but it took 3 decades for us to understand that it was a threat to our way of life. To act only when you feel threatened, not because something is incorrect or harmful for others, but because something is threatening to harm us, humans, I would say this is more selfish than ethical. And as for the last point, the alarm and fear frames, eco-anxiety is not just a trendy label nowadays, but a reality for many young and not so young people. It is actually an outcome of this rhetoric, and precisely because the gap between the problem and the response, and also because of the grandism of the narrative, is so huge that it produces paralysis in many people's minds, as usually grand narratives do, because they are too big to deal with for a simple individual. And if to this you add the framing of this narrative with fear and alarm, even if for benevolent goals, but the result is for many people to feel overwhelmed, to develop permanent fear, even panic. In general, to use fear as a strategy to persuade people is also ethically problematic. We know very well that in the grip of fear, our ability to think with clarity and act with responsibility is compromised. Therefore, triggering fear is actually disempowering people. If we want to fix the climate and the environmental problems, we need to empower people, not to scare them to death. Communication theorists, we know very well that fear also builds on and fosters stereotypes and irrationality. And it has always been the main goal pursued by propaganda in times of conflict and war. Frighten the people enough, and you will get them to accept anything. The risk of this is not only related to the paralysis, the inaction it can produce on people, but also related to democracy and fundamental rights of individuals. So, sorry for this long preamble, but it was needed for me to justify my approach as the rhetoric of climate change. And in short, it's to say that we know very well the severity of the problem. We know we have to change, but we are not changing as needed or even changing for worse, while we disempower citizens and leave leadership to stakeholders mostly concerned about keeping business as usual. So, of course, with this scenario, it's easy to imagine that for many people, climate change discussion has become empty words. That's why I call it rhetoric. So to assess the potential efficacy of this rhetoric, I'm going to review my conclusions from the recent work conducted within the Think Clima research project. I will to include here very quickly, because of course I do not have time and this is published work, so you can check them. But I will very quickly bring the results from the literature review conducted in my paper, Greening Animal Defense. And I will continue with the insights obtained regarding specifically the climate crisis frame in relation to the empirical research conducted in Think Clima for interest groups and climate change denial and obstructionism. So in the first case, I will be referring to specifically one paper published 3 years ago. And in the second case, I will be referring to a number of different papers that I'm not authoring alone at all. For any further reference, you can check, for instance, our website, where you will find more details there. So I am moving to the next slide. Now you should be seeing examination advocacy strategy. This refers to this paper where what I did here was to identify, let me move this on now, to identify the main arguments used by communication, advocacy, social psychology, and social marketing authors regarding the use of the environmental frame or any other indirect frame that makes for a comparison and that makes for an analysis of how useful it is. So from this literature review, I gathered some arguments for and some arguments against. The arguments for were the list you can see here. I'm not going to stop here, but more or less all these arguments can be applied to think that it's useful to use the environmental argument in animal advocacy, though all of them are also easy to counter-argue. Well, for the refuting, sorry, I was too fast. Maybe you see first the refuting, then the supporting. I wanted to show first the supporting and then the refuting. Maybe I moved and I skipped the first one without noticing. But for the refuting ones, here they were more difficult to refute. In this case, it was easy to see, for instance, that in service, the environment is not a major motivator for change. It's also easy to see that implicatory denial is a problem. Implicatory denial is a type of denial that we can find everywhere. It means that you can accept literal denial. You are not incurring in literal interpretative denial, that you can accept that there is climate change, that you accept and see that it's anthropogenic, but what you deny, you not accept, is the implications that follow from acknowledging the problem. This is very extended, and you can imagine, figure out that one of the main places this occurs is in diet, in the denial that society in general has to change diet, even though it's very clear that it would be something good for the environment, needless to say, for non-human animals as well, of course. Then the expectancy motivation theory, it's a theory explaining that if you use a secondary frame to advocate for your cause, you are creating some expectations that can be against your claim, because you are saying to the public, my claim, my core claim is not strong enough. I need this second claim to support my core claim. And you are generating an expectation of your core claim being weaker. So that's a problem. Then we also know that ethics is what guarantees long-lasting change. So only changing your habits, relating for instance, in what we are interested most in diet, because that reduces animal exploitation, but doing this for environmental reasons and not for animal ethical reasons is problematic, because probably won't last in time as if you are doing it because of animal ethics reason. Then also the simple thing of using a secondary claim to support your claim, in this case would be to support animal advocacy, can be speciesist, because of course you are putting on top of animal ethics, on top of animal suffering, on top of non-human animal exploitation, another argument that you are thinking will be more effective than just the suffering of animals exploited. This, some people say that also produces losing integrity, so also problematic. And then there is the incompatibility between animal ethics and environmental ethics, that, as you know, they don't share the core aim. Environmental ethics is not, has not as a priority animal defense, but ecological balance. So from this literature review, I concluded that, well, the refuting arguments were more robust, that non-moral claims are problematic because they do not guarantee citizens adhere to solutions that reduce or remove harms to other animals. They may adhere for a while, but not for long, because their core attention, their concern is not for, in our case, animal advocacy, but other issues related to climate. And then because of this, of course, this conflict between environmental ethics and animal ethics, in which probably the largest problem is that environmental ethics is to a large extent still speciesist. So my conclusion was that at that point, I was like saying, well, maybe not a straightforward claim against using the environmental frame for animal defense, but raising serious doubts about its efficacy. But after this, we conducted all our research for the climate change denial issue, which we started calling climate change denial, and we ended up using the word obstructionism. not denial for the reasons you will see. But after this research, I changed my mind towards a more critical stance of using the climate change frame for animal advocacy. Here, I cannot stop in all the things we did. A number of them, well, all the list here you see are published in papers or chapters in books. Majority of them were focused on the role of think tanks in Europe, but in all cases, we applied a non-anthropocentric gaze, which allowed us to look beyond what in general researchers look when focusing only on climate change. But from this research, a number of conclusions were drawn, and all of them together, we'll see how I make my point here. Well, what we saw was that it's true that there is a small climate change counter movement in Europe, but what is more problematic than just sheer denial is obstructionism. Obstructionism by the side of interest groups in general, but also corporations. And more problematic even the fact that a majority of actors in society, if not the majority, commit implicatory denial, which impacts directly in not changing their diet. And also we identify as a problem the reductionist frame of deniers versus non-deniers, a frame which hides the real spectrum of responsibilities in climate inaction. We could identify that obstructionism is the real problem, not denial. And I would say that that probably it's true also in the United States. Even if there we can find a more robust climate change denial counter movement, but still what we find in society, throughout society, is a large concern for climate change, but also a large concern, very strong concern for keeping business as usual. And with all this information, with a literature review, with what we saw from this Think Climate project, in the end, the conclusion was that, well, we are in front of a rhetoric, something that can be seen as empty rhetoric, as even greenwashing, as even propaganda. And when we are talking about empty rhetoric, greenwashing, and propaganda, these usually do not care about animal interests. So from this, I extracted like 4 main arguments against the rhetoric of climate change in animal defense, against using this rhetoric in animal defense. The first one is that it can be distracting and it decenters animal advocacy, and it can be misleading for this reason. The second one is that it's adhering to a problematic rhetoric, and because of this, it can risk public backlash. The third one is that its efficacy as a long-term effective argument is very questionable, at least as a long-term, and it has a high potential of backfire. So from these 4 main arguments, I have collected a few evidences for you to bring you less abstract words and more concrete and detailed examples. So for the first one, the risk of misleading, I am moving on with the slides. If you do not complain, I understand that you can see the slides moving on. So for the risk of misleading, for example, one thing we have noticed is that when animal advocates use the environmental frame or the climate change frame, they think they are incorporating intersectionality in their work. But this is a misunderstanding of intersectionality, because intersectionality is not about decentering our advocacy focus or efforts. Intersectionality is about understanding the common roots of all oppressions, about understanding the consequences of oppression overlapping. It's about not harming all the advocacy efforts with our advocacy efforts. And of course, it's about avoiding abuse and discrimination without our organization. That's intersectionality, not decentering our advocacy focus. And when you decenter your advocacy focus, you can be ending up with reinforcing speciesism. For instance, we think it is normal to advocate against animal exploitation in farms with a climate change rhetoric. For instance, with a claim like, we need to reduce animal exploitation in farms because this reduces global warming emissions. However, we would never accept to advocate against child labor in mining, for instance, with a climate change rhetoric. We would never say or accept we need to reduce child exploitation in mining because this reduces global warming. So this is a risk, reinforcing speciesism, a very, very, very realistic risk. Then because of the problems this rhetoric has, of course, we have the risk of obtaining the results of participating in a problematic rhetoric. Empty rhetoric often serves vested interests, is close to propaganda, and wastes resources because it's not useful. So all the resources put it on it is wasting money, effort, time. Also, the fear and anxiety frames often are not considered ethical frames in communication ethics, and often, maybe always, and undermine the public capacities for independent and critical thinking. So when confronted with these contradictions, people may end up reacting negatively to this rhetoric. So incorporating this rhetoric into animal advocacy incurs in this risk. Then for ineffectiveness and backfire, I have putting this both together. First of all, we see that climate change rhetoric defines the problem of animal exploitation in a very narrowing way, only in terms of the impact of animal agriculture on the environment. We know also that techno-financial capitalism is very skillful at sidestepping the problems with apparent solutions that fully focus in this rhetoric, in this climate change rhetoric, which of course neglects animal interest because it's not focused on animal ethics or on animal interest. It's focused on other things. Then the ineffectiveness of the climate change rhetoric, of course, can produce unexpected negative consequences for non-human animals. And here I have a number of examples for you, like starting with the feeding manipulation. If animal farming is harmful for the environment, we may think that the soundest direction is to reduce and eventually end animal farming. However, techno-financial capitalism's creativity is able to skip even the soundest. Instead, we are investing major resources and efforts on how to manipulate the food we give to the animals and their exploitation in order to reduce what we call their emissions. We can do this by changing their diet, what in some cases even may be beneficial for them. But remember, the goal is not them. The goal is not their well-being, but to reduce their emissions. So the solutions adopted may totally neglect their well-being or just redefine what well-being is, like in the second example, with precision pig feeding that includes, the authors say, attention to the well-being of the animals. Or this third one, because the increase of sustainability through the manipulation of the diet of the exploited animals can go further, like introducing insects in their food. It is true that some species of farmed animals may sporadically eat insects when in nature. But for the solution to have any relevant impact in terms of sustainability, you can imagine it is needed to radically transform the diet of the non-human animals exploited. The manipulation of the bodies of the animals exploited for the sake of the environment can go, however, even further, as in the methane capture, which can be from manure, but also which can be implemented through directly drilling the body of the animals, in this case the cows, and attach to it a variety type of engines that capture the gas from inside their bodies. For addressing the issue of emissions, some are even suggesting sustainable intensification, which means more animals exploited with less emissions produced, thanks to technology and management. This piece of news in the conversation, the one you have in front of you now, provides the clue on how this is expected to happen. You can read it on the right top. The authors say, achieving these savings will be dependent on improvements in feeding practices, better pastures, new types of food, more grains and others, improved ways of handling manure, and improved genetics and animal management. Many of these strategies are based on sustainable intensification, producing more livestock protein with fewer resources and storing carbon in the land. And here you can see a paper discussing on one of these strategies, in particular, how to improve the manure management through, in this case, 8 promising technologies, or even turning emissions into an apparent gain. Like in this case of this paper, manure management being converted into energy, in this case, biogas production. And research is also now able to turn emissions into feed for, in this case, farmed fish. This includes storing CO2 and methane emissions into food additives for animals, in this paper for fish, and also here for fish, in this case, methane with methanotropic bacteria that can transform methane into useful, what they call protein-rich biomass, which is, by the way, already approved for inclusion into animal feed for agriculture in some countries. As you can see, all this research is actually mind-blowing, reflecting the endless capacity we humans have to innovate and to be creative when funding and resources are available. However, again, the problem is that this just neglects the core point, that animals should not be exploited in the first place, even if they grab all this technology with enhancement for the animal diet and therefore with improvement of the animal well-being. But it's important to note that all the funding and resources devoted to this type of solutions means funding and resources which is diverted from being invested in alternative non-speciesist solutions. But of course, the major weak point regarding using climate change in animal advocacy is that at any moment, anyone can turn the argument around. For the argument of this example to be fully neutralized, we need animal ethics, not environmental ethics. And needless to say, the climate change rhetoric is leading us towards a totally new and unexpected scenario. Now I have in front of me, I hope you see it. If we want to save the planet, the future of food is insects by The Guardian. In this case, the expansion of animal exploitation is not only in terms of optimizing the business, not only in terms of increasing the pressure on the animal species already under exploitation, but also expanding the business into new species not industrially farmed until now, like insects and worms. And by the way, again, in Europe, crickets, locusts, and mealworms, beetle larvae, are already approved for the human diet. And I move now to the criminalization of certain species slide. Not less important is the criminalization of certain species out of environmental concern. For instance, an increasing and alarming trend is the criminalization of companion cats. Let's be clear, the alert over cats arises from valid concerns over threats to native species. However, this fear obscures the real driver of the problem of biodiversity loss, which is humans, of course, our exploitative treatment of the natural world. The panic generated against cats is due to an incorrect extrapolation of research supported by conservationists, ecologists, environmentalists, and the media. In particular, it is due to some scientists who have taken specific local studies on the impact of cats in certain areas and have overgeneralized those findings to the world at large, framing cats as killing machines contributors to mass extinction. Research, however, is not supporting this generalization, nor common sense. It is true that, like any other predator, cats can suppress the populations of their prey, yet the extent of their predation is by no means so direct, so simple. The potential impacts of cats radically differ from region to region. To assume that because cats are a problem for some species in some places, and to assume that because of this they are a problem in every place, this is simply bad science. And more importantly, and something which is neglected in this false crisis, is that research shows that the places where cats have a greater impact on their prey population are the ones we humans have impacted the most, are the ones most denuded of vegetation. Actually, what studies show is that the impacts of cats are directly proportional to human impacts on the areas. When we remove the vegetation, we reduce sheltering for their prey. So again, another human species created crisis. And finally, let me go a bit more in depth into how the climate change rhetoric can backfire on non-human animal interests by addressing animal-based food production and consumption. To provide some detail in this respect, I am bringing here, now you should be looking at a graph with the title Maximizing Animal Exploitation. And this is information from a report by the OECD and the FAO published in 2020, in which these organizations produce historical data and a prediction for this decade, current decade we are now, 2020 to 2030. This agricultural report starts by remembering that direct emissions from agriculture account for about 12% of global greenhouse gas emissions, but that, however, this is only for direct effects. When taking into account the indirect effects of agriculture, its contribution accounts for 21% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And as you know, around 80% of these 21% emissions from agriculture, around 80% are related to animal exploitation. And for the projections, the report states that in the current scenario, assuming that nothing changes in terms of policies and technology, direct agricultural emissions are projected to grow by 4% in this single decade. Again, animal-based food will account for more than 80% of this global increase. And what you see in the screen is the growth of production in what they call livestock and fish. And it is true. And as you can see in the next one, I have moved now to the next one where you can see figure 6.1. In this case, the second graph shows that most of the increase in direct emissions, it's true that is projected to occur in middle and low income regions. But the regions with some decrease, like Europe and Central Asia, are expected to have a tiny reduction of emissions of about 1% alone over this decade. And it is important to note that both the report and the industry are in general very satisfied with a detail that cannot go unnoticed for us. This is that this expected decrease of 1% in emissions in Europe and in Central Asia will happen in spite of a predicted growth of agricultural output. As you can see in this graph, in all regions, there is a predicted growth. The report in concrete predicts an 8% of agriculture output growing this decade in Europe and Central Asia. And what does this mean? Well, simply it means that it is expected an increase in production and of course in consumption with proportionally less emissions. And this is a global trend to reduce emissions from agriculture and of course from animal agriculture while keeping production and consumption growing. And how is that possible? Well, we have seen some answers in the examples previous to these slides. And in the case of animal farming, the increase in production with less emissions is expected, of course, to happen by means of the increase of the number of animals exploited and the increase of the pressure put on their bodies. For instance, the OECD FAO report informs of, now I have moved to their quotation, you should be looking at their quotation. They say in this report, for instance, that over the coming decade, milk and poultry outputs are projected to grow at the highest rates, 22% and 17% respectively in most countries, and that the larger output of meat and milk will be achieved by increasing the number of animals and improving the output per animal per year. Higher output per animal, in turn, will be mainly achieved through more intensive feeding practices improved genetics, and better herd management practices. So this is the trend. In Europe, per capita meat and fish consumption is not expected to increase, and consumers will increasingly replace red meat by poultry and dairy products, they say. But over the coming decade, global meat production is expected to increase by 13%, according to this report, and this will be due to increases in the number of animals and higher output per animal. I cannot enter into more detail on this because I need to start concluding, but I want to stress that this is the trend. Less emissions with more production, and therefore more pressure on the animals exploited and more animals under exploitation. And before going to my last slide, let me, however, review the main counter arguments that can be raised against my claim here, which is, okay, Núria, but there are some surveys supporting the environmental frame for animal defense. It's true, there are a few surveys, not very comprehensive, not with many people, not very decisive, but that they support that. But in any case, none is supporting guaranteeing long-lasting change. They identify that people may change their diet and start eating less meat, for instance, because of the concern for the environment and mostly because of the fear of climate change. But none of these surveys are able to guarantee long-lasting change. Then you may say also, well, that history of social justice advocacy has always included indirect strategies. We can all remember, for instance, the abolition of human slavery in the UK, for instance, that started with the abolition of the trade, not of the practice, which was an example of indirect strategy. That's true, but it's also true that we cannot find in the history of social justice advocacy claims that overtly decenter the core focus of what they were advocating for. Then you can say, okay, but different publics, as you, Núria, have said at the beginning, different publics need different strategies. That's true, but that doesn't mean that all strategies are effective. And finally, well, there are always exceptions, and I accept that, yes, there may be exceptions in where animal advocacy may use climate change advocacy for good. So to close on why I have been trying to argue here that climate change rhetoric as I have defined it, may be more harmful than beneficial for animal defense. I would say first, because of this risk of misleading, of backlash, of ineffectiveness and backfire, which is a very, very real risk actually becoming reality. So incorporating the climate change claim into animal advocacy means also buying in a claim that involves perpetuating speciesism, that involves an increasing the number of exploited beings, an increase in the abuse of the beings exploited, an increase of the discrimination of certain non-human animals. That's what we are buying in if we incorporate this rhetoric. And I would say that I don't know if that applies, or at this moment with this information, I would say the same for the whole environmental frame. The environmental frame is a wider frame, and it's much more nuanced, it's much more complex. It's probably that for the environmental frame, is there where we can find the exceptions. But for the climate change, if you accept this rhetoric I have presented to you, and at least this is how I see is the main dominant climate change claim nowadays going on, I think that it's not efficient to incorporate this into animal advocacy. But the opposite, I would say the opposite, it's true. We actually, with Marta Tafalla, that I think it's here in the audience, we actually published a paper talking about this, that it is probably that the animal ethics claim is more useful for environmental advocacy than the environmental claim is useful for animal advocacy. I cannot extend here on this, but I think we have more reasons to think in this direction than in the opposite. And that could be, I hope I have given some ideas for you to discuss, and I would be very pleased to know if you don't agree, why, and to point at the weak points of my argumentation, and just to listen to your ideas and your opinions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Núria. Okay, we certainly have plenty of time for discussion and questions. And I think those are applause symbols rather than hands up for questions, just in case I start asking you for questions. So yeah, if you want to use the hands up for questions, then you can form an orderly virtual queue. Okay, I see Ariana has her hand up. So let's go over to Ariana. And you might be muted. Yeah, you're muted, Ariana.
Sorry, it's the typical error. Hi, everybody. Thank you very much, Núria, for your wonderful talk. Very impressed, and I really much agree on your points. I would like to draw, nevertheless, attention to something which is concerning me in these days about using some environmental and climate change frame to decrease meat consumption and consumption of animal products. I'm working in an environmental NGO in Germany, so I know, and I'm not working on topics connected with animals, although I receive from the first place, so to say, the discussion there. And there is and in Germany, maybe it's not, you already saw told in your slide that there are some more progressive, so to say, or counter movement in UK and Germany about using climate change. So maybe it's not representative for everything in Europe, but the main environmental NGO in Germany, such as, for example, Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace, and also Greenpeace International, and especially in connection with the Ukraine war, are using, accounting or defending the urgent need for decreasing the consumption of meat and animal products, and to decrease the number of the animal used in agriculture. And to decrease the number of the animal, of course, is not per se an animal ethic argument, and is not per se an anti-speciesism or liberational argument. But since you decrease the number, you save individuals, animal individuals. So in a sense, in this sense, if they strictly apply, of course, they are using also other arguments in which they say we have to support sustainable animal agriculture and blah, 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 this rhetoric. But this decrease of the number of animals, and there is a huge political debate in the moment in Germany, because they are pushing it for doing a law to decrease the number of animals used. And this would be would mean not the center in the focus of the animal interest, but just supporting it in a more slowly way, in a sense. So maybe this is just an exception. And the second is more a comment on what you said about the report of the UN and the FAO about the future of animal agriculture. I would not to be so critical about this report, in the sense that their provision, I would take it a little bit more in a descriptive way, because their provision are based on the status quo of what the policies of the country says about their strategies of about the need for fish and meat consumption, and about their agricultural policy. And there is no political program, I think, in the world which states that there is a need of reduction of animal agriculture, of the number of animals used, but it's just there is the climate change problem. So in a sense, I think that the FAO report is more on the status quo, and they are doing provision like this as not a normative statement, so to say. So there is still maybe a hope, because if the politics turns and there are other frameworks, for example, this reduction of the animal use, then the provision will, the provision of the use of animal can change. Sorry for being a little bit long.
No, thank you, thank you. I fully agree. Yes, this report is fully descriptive. They actually say if nothing change, this is what we can predict from what we have now. It's not they are making any normative claim, of course. And yes, what you have said can be an exception. This can be really not decentering the focus, this trend of explicitly requesting for reducing the number of animals exploited. Thank you, Ariana.
Sophia?
Hi, thank you very much, Núria. I very much enjoyed your talk, and thank you, Richard, for organizing and bringing us together. It was also a provocative talk for me, because I'm actually leading a project on meat consumption and climate change right now. And I mean, my interest in that came, I'm a philosopher of science, it came from actually participating in animal research and becoming interested in the use of animals in agriculture. So animal welfare and animal ethics are important to me, but I am leading a project that is driven by this, frame of sustainability. So so I take your message, to heart. And I'm also, as Ariana said, a bit like, I see, first of all, I want to agree with you that the environmental frame, as you called it, I think might indeed not be a frame that emphasizes the value of individual animal life. And I think one way to think about this is by analogy to racialist thinking. So, or in environmentalist thinking or ecological thinking, we're probably thinking about populations of animals or species. And another example I think that could be interesting for you, besides this idea of like cats, villainous cats, could be the concept of invasive species or native species and how that's used in ecology. So it seems to me that certainly those ways of thinking are interested in populations and not individuals, and some concept of population health or welfare or whatever, or balance or ecosystem. So so I think that those could be concepts to like further perhaps develop this hunch in a way, or this insight that you have that maybe those frames are not suitable for advocating for animal rights or animal what we call what else, liberation, right? So that was one point. But on the I think I was thinking along the lines of Ariana's point as well, that I see that this optimization and effectivization of the meat industry is definitely one way in which these industries are orienting themselves in response to climate change rhetoric or requirements. And certainly those techniques might reduce emissions, but at least several studies show that they won't reduce emissions as much as a plant-based diet. So certainly there are still arguments for reducing, our use of animals for food, no matter how much we effectivize the current systems. And I think that's pretty simple. But there was a study by Poor and all, like 2018 and Oxford, with some numbers on that. So yeah, so those were my two, I think, comments on that. And so I would agree with you that there's certainly a risk of course, there's these are different projects, you know, climate change and like mitigation and animal rights, but I hope there is some overlap in in reducing the use of animals for food. And at least also maybe in improving animal welfare within these industries if you move towards less intensive farming. Thank you. I hope that's not too long a question.
No, it was very interesting. Thank you. Actually, you are embedded in my first exception I mentioned. So
okay.
funding for climate change issues is, I think, I did it myself. The problem is that funding is so concentrated, so much concentrated on anything that includes the label climate change that forces us. Yes, but well, I think if we keep this in mind, these risks in mind, with our perspective, in our case as researchers, I don't think it's a big problem as long as we don't make larger this grand narration of climate change, and we give content really to what should be the claim to react. But of course, that's super difficult because so many stakeholders involved and so many synergies and interests. And please go ahead with your topic, and I'm clearly an exception for all of that. Thank you, Sophia.
Thanks, Núria.
Here we have a question from Alex Lockwood.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Núria. I've read lots of your work and really enjoyed reading it. I read the chapter on the EU meat lobby and the meat-splaining collection recently and enjoyed it. I really didn't want to agree with what you were saying because I've been involved in developing the campaigns on the ground in terms of using, you know, environmental and climate frames. But I did find myself agreeing with the majority of your points. But then I got confused, to be honest, when you got to the examples, because your title was about using climate change rhetoric in animal advocacy. But then the example showing us for the evidence was from articles and the UN. It wasn't from advocacy groups. So because I was there in Animal Rebellion as we were developing strategies for using climate and environmental frames as animal activists. A large part of what we were doing was actually trying to shift the environmental movement, which was much bigger, better funded, many more constituents, much more bigger membership base across Europe and the world, to talk about animal agriculture because they were completely ignoring it. And I think that actually the strategy was a good one and has shifted a lot of organizations now, like WWF, Greenpeace, to talk much more about animal agriculture. And of course, that might fit into your exceptions. But my question was, this question is about, like, because I agree with you that climate change rhetoric is empty and has been co-opted and is really easy to, you know, and has gone in that direction. But as activists on the ground, we didn't feel that we were using the rhetoric. We felt that we were making climate change, climate crisis arguments our own, and with a clear target of shifting environmental groups to talk more about animal agriculture. So in that sense, we weren't using rhetoric. You know, that was, so I want you to, you know, talk about the advocacy groups, you know, in that terms. And the second point is just animal liberation frames haven't really worked. And I think a large part of why groups have adopted climate change, climate crisis frames is because it's a lot of young people who are desperately seeking conclusions, and they see the climate crisis as the urgent, you know, and they're animal liberationists, they're you know, animal freedom, animal defenders, and have been drawn into it because they're not really seeing any better options. Because actually, I feel in many ways the animal movement, you know, animal organizations and animal movements haven't really collectively got together to really push forward more powerful, impactful frames. So I wondered if you had a thought on what those frames could be. You know, if we're not going to use the climate rhetoric, what are we using?
Yes, thank you, Alex. I was expecting this question. First of all, the examples were not including any campaign, because my aim was not to criticize campaigns. It was not to criticize animal advocates using the environmental frame at all. I was more just throwing ideas and seeing your reaction to them. But I don't have an answer. I don't know. I am pretty aware of the problems of the ethical frame. The ethical frame can be considered patronizing, has also raised backlash because people don't like to be told what's the right thing to do. So also there are lots of problems with the ethical frame, which would be the animal liberation, focusing only on the animals. But I don't know, I don't have the answer, and probably there is not a single answer. My main claim with my talk is just be aware of that. And this grand narrative is not a grand narrative created by NGOs or by work by people like you. This grand narrative is the narrative that is useful for vested interest. And of course, it's the one we have. So we have to play in this game. And the games, we cannot change the rules. But I'm just saying, watch out, the rules are not right. So be careful, because we are playing in a game in which the rules should be changed. But we don't have, as advocates, we of course don't have the power to change all this complex scenario. But my main aim was not at all to criticize animal advocacy, but just to alert of something that I have actually experienced in myself, because of having to request funding with the climate change claim, and realizing how difficult it was to stick to my first purpose, which was the anti-anthropocentric gaze, the anti-speciesist gaze within it. But of course, the narrative is not for this. So we had to struggle all the time we want to have this gaze. And it's just an alert, what I have launched here, not a criticism to animal advocates. I don't have the answer. I could give a talk with my ideas about this, but I should really think about carefully, because there can't be one single answer for sure. You know very well that.
Can I reply to that very quickly, Richard? Is that okay? Yeah. I would love you to share your ideas and think carefully about that, because I think you're a great thinker and your work has been, you know, really important in this area. So I would welcome you absolutely to provide critique of advocacy and to share your ideas. I think it would be incredibly valuable for us. And I agree with the majority of your points here about being aware and alert. And I just wanted to let you know that I'm still involved with organisations, like helping them frame where the narratives are going. And the point you made right at the end of like the animal, you know, the framing animals is much more useful for the environment movement than the other way around, is actually a lot of the place where we're hoping to go with that, because actually it's really important to move. It's like, for all of the reasons that you raised. So yeah, I just wanted to say that.
Thank you. I always divided myself into whether do more research on political economy or on results and advocacy, because, you know, I work a lot on political economy because I think this is something really missing. And yes, but yes, I understand that it's more practical to construct. When you work on political economy, you are just criticizing, actually. But I think it's also important to like unveil what's there. But thank you so much for your kind words.
Thanks, Alex. I'm going to jump in with a question. And now, for me, maybe your talk is a reminder of the need to always frame the climate crisis alongside the biodiversity crisis, and to understand how the interrelation between the two, and how the sixth mass extinction that we're currently going through is partly being caused by the climate crisis, but also has a much wider causation as well. And so the threats to species are from direct hunting and habitat destruction, which are separate to the reasons from the climate crisis, such as the way in which rising temperatures and droughts and wildfires and so on are killing animals and so on. So once we remind ourselves of the need to kind of have that broader frame and to kind of understand the intersections between the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis, I think we can realize that the climate frame is not decentering of animal advocacy. It's absolutely imperative, and the animal advocacy movement cannot avoid adopting a climate frame because of the way in which the climate crisis is already killing many millions of animals, as we saw in the so-called Black Summer in Australia, and as we've also seen in Brazil since then as well. So, and another point is that the need for the climate frame and the animal advocacy movement is also about strengthening the critique of capitalism from the animal advocacy movement, because really we need to educate the animal advocacy movement about political economy and about the history of capitalism. And for me, that means joining with kind of more eco-socialist perspectives and rejecting the notion of the Anthropocene and accepting the notion of the Capitalocene and so on. So I don't totally agree with your argument. I think the climate frame is not a second order. It's not like using another frame to argue for animal advocacy. It's an indispensable and necessary point, and I think it's unavoidable. And I think it's about a little bit similar to what Alex said. It's about taking animal ethics and the critique of anthropocentrism into the climate frame, and the critique of capitalism into the climate frame. Okay, so that's just my perspective.
Thank you. I think what we're talking about is another time. So the grand narrative of climate change, what I call the climate change rhetoric, is concerned of biodiversity for different reasons than we non-species scholars are. So the necessity you see in incorporating climate change into animal advocacy, I agree with you fully. Of course, there is an impact, a very, very important impact on non-human animals that we cannot neglect. Actually, we tend to say that you are not a real environmentalist if you eat meat. And I think we could say the opposite. You are not really an anti-speciesist if you are not concerned for the environment. But the grand narrative about this rhetoric I was talking about don't care for this. The biodiversity concept they have is about an objective which is has nothing to do with animal ethics. It has to do with the balance that the planet must have because we humans can live in it. It's very human-centered. The biodiversity concept is a very human-centered concept because it's about species, not about individuals. And for non-species gaze, you should focus on individuals, not on species. So from the very beginning, you have this So I agree with what you say, but I don't think that what you say is included in the rhetoric I was explaining, which is the measure rhetoric, which is, this rhetoric is the one deciding who is funded, what actions are taken, there is no concern for individual animals in the way we have this concept. But I fully agree, of course, non-species scholars, advocates, and people must be concerned for climate change and incorporate this concern. I fully agree with this.
But I don't think biodiversity has to be framed in that way. It can be, it can be, there can be a nice affinity, I think, between animal ethics and biodiversity. And I think that this gets us into the importance for the animal liberation movement to also move beyond its kind of dichotomy between domesticated and wild animals as well. And I think,
I agree. I fully agree.
But
the concept of biodiversity means is not this. I mean, if you read about biodiversity in regulation, in handbooks, in environment,
it's ecological services and all this kind of thing.
Not what I've said. So I fully agree we have to turn it into this, but it's not when they, I don't know, take, for instance, the CITES convention. I don't know if it's pronounced correctly, CITES, where biodiversity is their main concern. And of course, it has nothing to do with ethics towards individuals that are sentient. It's about the construct we have of what animals, what species are more important than others, what are more useful than others.
Yeah. Shall we move to Jordan? Jordan? Yeah.
Sure. Hi, I'm here. Thank you, Núria, so much for the talk. It was really a pleasure. And as we've been having the conversation, I've been rethinking how I should frame my question, because every time a new layer gets added to it and I have to think about it again. And yes, I do agree with biodiversity and talking about climate change as mostly ineffective in terms of speaking to people who are, let's say, like for me, I do ethnography, speaking to people in the field who don't think about in these broad spectrums in terms of climate change and biodiversity, but think more in a local context. And then you have policymakers and scientists who we think more in these bigger concepts, and we come to think through these concepts as a way of thinking. And I really like, I've recently read Timothy Morton's Being Ecological. And I think this speaks a lot to some of the challenges you're talking about, where it's not just about, I think he calls it like information dump modes, where you're just using these terms, these large objects that have such power behind them, but at the same time, in certain instances don't, because they don't have this effect to actually change people's opinions about certain things, because they may not be thinking in the same way that you're thinking about the concepts. And it does at the same time remove the individual aspect of animal well-being. And so this is something that needs to be considered. So I'm wondering if you think that it would be more important to really touch on more contextualized instances of where the environment plays a role in animal exploitation. So the geographies of meat production, for instance, and how these landscapes change and are shaped by meat production and become toxic for the people that are working there, for the communities, also for the animals. And maybe how there is also other industries that are already maybe undergoing certain changes based on climate change and biodiversity, threats to climate change and biodiversity. Like, for instance, I can use the example of in Germany in rewilding processes, or to create more biodiversity in industrial logging, where they had pines that were mostly being produced for the industry, and now there's issues with drought, as well as these wood beetles that are causing them to die out. If you go to some of the national parks in Germany, we have this huge problems with forests that are just half dead. And people are recognizing that this needs to be changed, are undergoing the changes. And then biodiversity comes along, and you're trying to care for not just like biodiversity as a whole, but also the connection between the trees. So, or the connection between the trees and other forest inhabitants, so to say. But you're right. And Morten talks about this, is that you have the one big concept of biodiversity, but then within it, you have the individuals. And so there's different types of thinking that has to be done here. But yeah, do you think contextualizing it is really what should be done, or could be a way, versus just doing away with ecological thinking and climate change altogether? Perhaps it's the frameworks that are the issue, that they're so large that it's hard to grasp them, and they also remove this individual aspect.
So by contextualizing, you mean redefining the concepts with a non-species list, for instance? What
or just like trying to really not push concepts at people. So, just if there's issues that are at place that are related to things that we understand, or that the climate is changing, or that there's environmental problems from greenhouse gas emissions that are taking place in the world that can be observable, rather than then pushing the rhetoric of, well, it's climate change, or it's the biodiversity is an issue here, but really trying to just come to terms with the issues that people are dealing with and that animals are dealing with in a way that makes sense for the public and for people that work with animals and people that consume meat. That's not just, here's the big problem, but rather here are some instances of that can be connected to, so to say. So really trying to bring it back down to a more contextualized local level, rather than this big global object of climate change and biodiversity and stuff.
Well, that for sure would help, because all those, my criticism of grand narratives was precisely that are like big abstract concepts, which are very difficult to manage. So for sure we will be able to manage and to improve this narrative, or redirect this narrative, if we like lay it down on context and not talking in abstract. But you have said many interesting things that I fully agree. I don't know if you were trying to, or maybe you were, and it's me that I did not understand it, to be more understanding with all these people that are trying to do things with an environmental gaze, and even farmers. If that's the case, I agree. I don't think we have to blame everybody. I don't think we have to blame anyone. It's difficult when you try to unveil power relations that you are not like pointing at the culprits, but that shouldn't be the goal. The goal of unveiling how things work is not to find culprits, but to find a way of disentangle the thing, at least for me. Thank you for your commentary, Jordan.
Kiko, if it's a really quick one, we can finish with your question. Thanks.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Kiko.
Okay. Hi. Sorry. Now. Okay. Yeah. Of course. Super interesting talk. Thank you very much. I'm not going to talk about the progress thing, but of course it's involved with that idea of we can progress to a technical way of exploiting them more and having less consequences for having. And I love that emphasis on their emissions, like they are our emissions through them. So yeah, totally the point. And I was thinking about that thing that you said about the how did you talk about it? Okay, I think that it's kind of a naive belief that we can have of climate change rhetoric being useful to animal advocacy because we are desperate and anything that is kind of related to the topic is kind of, it seems useful to our fight, but it's not. It's like a
Yeah, your sound is cracking up, Kiko.
okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. Let me.
You are in a storm.
How about now?
That's much better. Yeah.
Okay, the word there is. Okay, I was saying that I think that it's kind of a naive belief to think that the climate change rhetoric is going to be useful for our fight only because it's kind of related to the sentient and the living beings. But I think that is just because we are desperate. We don't achieve almost anything, and I understand that we have that temptation of believing that this rhetoric is going to help us. But I think, as you, that is important to keep it clear and to keep that environmentalist way of point of view out of our reasoning. And I also see that relation with the intersectionality misunderstood. And I think is in this university, in fact, in this campus, I saw a message, a poster or something, with a phrase in Spanish with something like, if your feminism is useful or is used to sell something, it's not advocacy, it's marketing. And I think that's applied to all the propaganda, all the rhetoric. So I don't know how at this stage of the things we still have that naive, that innocent way of thinking that is going to help us. It's like the media are not going to help us of any case. So why we keep thinking like that? But I think they have done their work, because there is actually a need in the market for animals product, sustainable ones, because they have already created the need that they are, and I'm like super shocked with the fact that they prefer to create a new need for eating insects than, which is a more a heavier change in our way of thinking about food, at least in Spain or Europe and etc. But they prefer that to change to a non-specialist point of view. Is amazing. Like they, as you said, is the creativity in service to that interest. They of course are like beyond our perception. So yeah, I found it super necessary to have this clear on mind. And since I come from scouts and something like that, I have this background of this environmental background, but now I'm realizing that they are super specialist. So yeah, we need to have this conversation. So yes, thank you so much.
Núria, you're on mute.
I was saying just thank you, Kiko. I think we are out of time, so I'm not going to expand. Just to say that I don't think we have to get rid of environmentalism. We have to get rid of the species part of environmentalism. I would conclude with this just.
Thank you, Núria. That's a nice point at which to conclude. And thank you so much for your talk. We had over 50 people during the talk, so that was great.
I say just one thing. Is any possibility that you don't close immediately so I can have time to read the comments?
Yes, I think so. Perhaps Claire could stop the recording now, but then still keep the